So Resident Evil has for a long time been one of my favorite gaming franchises, but fully admittedly, I had actually never played Resident Evil 4. Now, that was simply because of the fact that when I got into Resident Evil, it was in the beginning of the era of the remakes, and so I had always assumed that we'd get here eventually, and, well, quite frankly, here we are. So without any further ado, guys, my name is Dig Dug Gaming, and today I will be reviewing the Resident Evil 4 remake. Let's go ahead and dive right on in. Now, starting things off like I always do in my reviews, we'll go ahead and kick things off with the story. It's got a relatively simple premise. So you follow Leon Kennedy, who is the same protagonist from Resident Evil 2 and later on Resident Evil 6, as you go to rescue the president's daughter. Now, they are in a village in the middle of the woods, and quite frankly and quite obviously, things do not go remotely as planned for our people, our hero involved. And so you follow this really crazy journey. It's not just in the village, too. By the end of the game, you go to multiple different areas, and there's some really good variety there, but I'll touch on that later. But as far as the story itself goes, it's relatively simple. I do think that this is definitely one of the better Resident Evil stories that I have played, which also, in all fairness, isn't saying a whole lot, but at the same time, this actually does have a pretty decent story. Again, the premise is there and simple, but along the way, you meet a pretty nice cast of characters. I'd say that there are some definite standouts for sure, and there's some really iconic moments for sure throughout the story as well. That's definitely a true statement. And so, throughout the game, the story kind of keeps things going, though. Again, I say it's decent. I say it's one of the better Resident Evil stories. It's also not a game that I'm going to sit here and tell you has some groundbreaking story. It's definitely more than just serviceable. It's definitely good, but it's not groundbreaking or the selling point either, I would say. What really is, to me, the selling point is the gameplay and the environments. Now, with the gameplay, for sure, is a bit more action-oriented than some of the other games in the franchise, specifically what we've been used to with Resident Evil 2 and also Resident Evil 7. It's much more in line with a Resident Evil 3 or Village type, again, comparing it to the more recent entries, where there's definitely a much more action-oriented approach. However, I think it handles that approach better than those other games, especially the Resident Evil 3 remake, in the sense that the Resident Evil 4 remake still manages to hold on to the horror aspect of the game while having that action gameplay premise, right? There is a emphasis on the action without losing the horror, I guess is what I'm trying to say. You, of course, have the melee attacks is one of the big things that keeps this different from the other games in the franchise, where if you get enemies weak enough, you can use a melee attack and it will counter them, it'll do a lot of damage, but it's also very, action-y in that approach, as well as the ability to parry enemies. So in the beginning of the game, I'll use this as the example, there is a chainsaw man that chases you around in the opening section of the game, and it is entirely possible for you to parry the chainsaw with your knife, which obviously is really cool when it happens, but it's obviously also a bit goofy and a bit more of an action-y thing, and that's just kind of how this game works. Again, I think it balances it a lot better than the other games in the franchise, but it's very much still there. I do think also that the game does a really good job at rewarding the action gameplay. It encourages it in the sense that a lot of the time, if I was running past enemies or trying to avoid them in any way, I would find that my resources would end up reflecting that. I would have very little resources, very little ammo and heals and everything. But on the flip side, if I found myself engaging in the combat more and really embracing that aspect of the game more, I was being rewarded for it and getting all sorts of goodies and resources as a result. And it is because enemies will individually drop things when you beat them, whether it is ammo or heals or just the in-game currency which you can use to buy ammo, heals, and guns. It very much rewards you for what you do, but also encourages you to actually embrace the action element of the gameplay, or at least, engage in combat more often than you might choose to in, say, Resident Evil 2. Now, moving on, I also did want to touch on the environments, because that is also a big piece of why I love this game so much. I feel like this game has some very well-designed environments and very well thought out and well-crafted areas all around. Again, I mentioned the game starts you off in a village. You do not finish there. You do go to multiple different areas, and even within those areas, there's other areas in them. And each one of them is very iconic in its own right. You do have, of course, I'll keep mentioning the village, where there is all the villagers. It's more of a standard design. You next go to the castle area, which is a giant sprawling castle with new enemy types, some of the old enemy types. I found there was a lot more of puzzle influence going on, at least in my opinion, in the castle area. And then, of course, the final area, which is basically just an action straight shot to the end of the game. Now, I did also want to mention, again, as we're talking about gameplay and the environments, this game has some really fun boss fights. That's not really something, when I think of Resident Evil, boss fight is not the first thing that comes to my mind, but I guess with the action approach to the gameplay, they also had some, good excuses for some boss fights. And again, I really liked them. You have some pretty iconic ones, obviously. You're looking at the final boss. You're looking at the fight with Krauser near the end of the game. You also have El Gigante. You have, of course, the ever iconic 2 El Gigante fight. And then, while not bosses, I did also want to give a shout out to the Regenerators for sure. Those guys were definitely really fun and a nice kind of unique enemy type. I also, of course, did gloss over the Vertigo as well, which is... Honestly, I struggled with him a lot, because it's a boss that you can kill, but you're not entirely supposed to, and I was just dead set on trying to kill him. And seeing as how I played through this game on hard mode, it did not go very well at all. We'll leave it at that. I did not have a great time with that boss fight, though I'm sure it would be a lot different if I was actually playing it more or less like you are supposed to. I did want to touch on something real quick as well, while not any impact to the game overall. The remake, at least as of now, does not include the Separate Ways DLC that the original did, or at least ended up getting as Ada Wong. So I'm sure that's something we're looking at in the future. I would assume, based on history and based on how everything seems to work nowadays, that that's coming probably next year to tide us over until the inevitable Resident Evil 9 comes out, or the remake of 5, which is obviously something we're probably looking at coming in the future. But yeah, this is definitely, as I said at the beginning of the video, Resident Evil is probably my second favorite gaming franchise. It's definitely up there, and this is my favorite game in the franchise, wholeheartedly, which I did not think going in was going to be an easy task, and it ended up being a pretty easy task with just how good this game is. As I mentioned, I'll touch on a few things again. The story was good enough. I really just enjoyed the gameplay and the fun that I had finding the collectibles. There is a lot of side content in this game. There is a merchant guy that will give you these quests that you can do, and they don't really impact the gameplay as far as they don't really impact the main story per se, of course, but as you're walking around, you'll find a side quest, and then you can go do it. You get resources, which are obviously then used to do more stuff in the game. You can use it to buy more items and resources, and it really rewards the player for searching and doing it. I felt like it was a very rewarding process, is what I'm trying to say, for the side content that you do. Alright guys, with that being said, it's time to give my score for this game, which, as is probably expected, this game is a masterpiece. I'm going to go ahead and give it a score of a 10 out of 10. I don't quite know if it'll end up being my game of the year this year. Admittedly, I'm probably, as of now, giving that to Final Fantasy 16, which, spoiler alert, review for that should be coming pretty soon. And I'm assuming Spider-Man 2, just based on my personal preference, will end up probably taking the title. But it's also just a phenomenal game. If it released in any year other than this one, I would probably win my game of the year, at least for me personally. But yeah, I have nothing bad to say about this game. It's a very fun and engaging game, and I mean, yeah, it's a 10 out of 10, right? There's nothing I could say that would really critique this game. With that being said, guys, thank you so much for watching today's video. If you liked it, don't forget to drop a like, and also comment your thoughts on the game below if you've played it. I did, I guess, briefly mention that I'll be reviewing Final Fantasy 16 soon. I know that's taking absolutely forever. It is a massive game, and I am trying to do a lot of the side content. I'm trying to do all of it. And so that's what's making the review take so long, and I'm also just caught up playing other games in the meantime as well. So, again, guys, that review is still coming. Wanted to give a quick update on that. But as always, again, thank you for watching today's video, and I hope to see you guys back in the next one.